Trek favorites. What are yours? Welcome to Trek Favorites. This is the show where I get to talk to some of my tech friends and my Trek friends about their favorite episodes or one of their favorite episodes of any of the Star Trek series. Folks, we don't waste a lot of time here doing recaps. We figure that you're already familiar with the episode. If not, there's a link in the show notes to Memory Alpha for this particular episode so that you can go back and refresh your memory or go back and rewatch it on whatever service you can find Star Trek on at any given moment. This time, I'm really excited to have John Martellaro join me to talk about Season 5, Episode 25 of Star Trek The Next Generation. The episode is The Inner Light. John, it's great to see you. Thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's fun to talk about Star Trek with you. Cool.
Well, you have a reputation for being a bit of a Star Trek geek, I think. A science geek, a science fiction geek, and definitely a Star Trek geek.
Well, I have to show you the picture of my dorm room at the university I went to, where my roommate and I are sitting on the bed, and he has his copy of Sky and Telescope, and I have my single lens reflex camera, and behind us is a giant poster of Mr. Spock from the original Star Trek series.
See, I'm not surprised at all. I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
Well, and
they call me Mr. Spock. My girlfriend's friends called me Mr. Spock when I was an undergraduate. I was an astrophysics major, and very studious and very quiet and very cerebral, and I worshipped Commander Spock, so I became him at the university.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that. I want to but I hear you on the Daily Observations podcast for the Mac Observer, and I hear not constant references, but regular references to Star Trek. So it's kind of transparent that you are a Star Trek fan.
And Next Generation is my favorite series, although Star Trek Discovery is pretty cool. And Captain Jean-Luc Picard, Patrick Stewart, is my favorite starship captain. So it all came together when you invited me to be on the show, and I thought, what is my favorite episode? Oh, of course, it's Jean-Luc Picard in The Inner Light. It's got to be. And it won a Hugo Award the next year. This show aired in late May of 1992 and won the Hugo Award in 1993 in this category. It's just an awesome, poignant, beautiful, technical, brilliant screenplay.
Okay, I agree with all those statements, except maybe one in your case. Because when I invited you, I was sort of thinking that you would pick a more technology-oriented episode. And this is not terribly technology-oriented. This is more a humanistic kind of story.
I love science fiction that uses technology as a low-key backdrop. One of my favorite series on Netflix is Travelers, which has come to a conclusion. And Travelers is full of technology, but it's not showcased. It's just sort of under the surface, and provides a backdrop. And things are taken for granted instead of ballyhooed. And I like shows like that. And The Inner Light is a show that focuses on some very human elements. And that's why it tugs at your heartstrings, is because it's not just technology, but it's about a person who's a starship captain who never had a chance to have a wife, to raise a son, to raise a daughter, to do backyard astronomy, to have a grandson. He lived his life on Catan in a very technical but yet humanistic way, where he learned to respect the ways of his people, and he learned to love his wife and have children with her, and all those things a starship captain couldn't do because of his obligations. And then when he's talking to his daughter, when he realizes that the planet's dying and their sun is going to go nova, he tells her, live in the current time, live in the now. Now will never come again, because he knows the end is coming near. And so there is this juxtaposition of the pang of the starship captain being torn away from his life, never having hopes of getting back to it, and then living out a life as a semi-technical person, raising children, and then going through the process of realizing that his children aren't going to survive because of the star going to go nova. So technology without the human element is not science fiction. It's just geekdom. That's a dime a dozen. But to tell a powerful human story, that's something. And that's why it won the Hugo Award in '93.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what happens here. Picard is affected by the alien probe and basically thrust into another life mentally, from a mental perspective. Did it surprise you that, if I remember the timeline of the chronology correctly here, he was within that life experientially for 5 years before it seemed like he gave in to that life? Maybe a little shorter time, maybe a little longer.
I remember that scene.
Yeah.
She said his wife, Elina, Elina, said, it's been 5 years now, and I've been very patient with you.
Yeah, and John, it's surprising. I mean, knowing the Picard character as well as we all do, is that why did he decide to not give up? That may not be the right word, but to embrace this life as opposed to resisting it. I mean, obviously, right initially when he woke up, he's very much resisting and very trying to figure out what's going on.
Computer and program.
Yeah, but at the end, at that 5-year mark, he seems to say, "Okay, I've just got to kind of go with this life. This is now my life." Instead of continuing to find out what happened and how it happened and how does he get back, and that I don't know if it struck me as just a little out of Picard's character.
I don't think so. I think an unreasonable fetish would be characteristic of a smaller mind. I think finally Jean-Luc Picard, seeking balance and already having been mentally healthy, realized that he couldn't keep on fighting. That wouldn't be mentally healthy for him. And accepting the situation. He's a smart, capable, strong leader, and you don't get to be a starship captain without being mentally healthy and having good perspectives and knowing how to optimize and make decisions. So I think it just was in tune with his character.
I guess what surprised me, or not surprised me, but it's sort of a precursor to what happened in Star Trek Generations when Picard was in the Nexus, and he's surrounded by children, grandchildren, a loving wife, that Christmas tree scene. You get this impression that this is something that he has wanted. He chose the starship captain life, but it seems like these are things that he has wanted at one time or another, and now he gets to have it, and it's not real.
Well, it's certainly real on the planet Catan for him at that time.
At the time it's going on, yeah. And so, now let's get into just a little geekery. You have to wonder, how was this thing programmed? Was it inserting him as a character into someone else's life, or was it programmed to react to him? Because it seems like it almost had to be programmed to react to him because he decided to become a father in that life, and that he could have continued to resist.
I don't know that the probe specifically knew who it was going to be connecting with. It's just any sentient being who could carry on the memory of the planet. What I thought was interesting, though, was that their technology before the star went nova was pretty primitive. I mean, they had cool push button open doors, but they didn't have very sophisticated communications, and you didn't see any computers around or handheld devices. And they talked about how they had just basically learned how to build missiles and launch them, and getting into orbit was kind of a struggle for them. So for a civilization where building a rocket that can go into orbit is really tough, how did they program a probe to send this nucleonic beam into a sentient being's mind and act out this lifelong scenario? I mean, the two technologies didn't mesh for me.
No, I agree, and that's what made me wonder: was this for lack of a better word, a storybook kind of existence to help Picard remember the Catan race,
Sure.
as opposed to being an accurate representation of their race at the end, as you said, because the technology just didn't seem to mesh.
Well, that's just a technical point of the show. It shouldn't be taken to discredit the flavor and the motivation of the author, or the writer. I mean, it was just an artifact that had to happen in order for the show to succeed. So,
and I absolutely agree with that. It takes nothing away from it. It's just one of those things that if you stop and analyze it, there's a little bit of an inconsistency there.
Yeah. The other thing that I liked about this show is the Resican flute. Picard is given this flute, which, by the way, is non-functional. He learns how to move his fingers, I read, but the flute itself doesn't make any noise. They added the music in the post-production. So that was interesting. Yeah. And there's a really poignant scene at the end of the show when he's in his quarters and he's playing the flute and remembering his life on the planet as then the starship disappears into the distance. And it sort of punctuates a life well lived that people write about, fantasize about. That not only does he have a memory of the life of the people on Catan that she carries forward, and not only does the flute appear in subsequent episodes, I hear it's been seen in some of the shootings of Star Trek Picard, which is coming up. It symbolizes the poignancy of both his decisions to live the kind of life he lives. Many people struggle with that. We were talking about Mr. Spock earlier. People in high-level positions often have to sacrifice family or sacrifice other things in order to pursue their career. And then there comes a time when they may or may not regret the choices they made. And you see lots of movies on TV about professional people who miss their daughter's dance recital or their Christmas play, and they live to regret it. So there's that sub-theme. And then there's the other interesting theme in my mind is in 1992, when the show aired, a civilization that's suffering drought and whose planet is dying was science fiction. Not so much today anymore, where we're confronted with the reality that our planet is finite and is taking some dings from humans. And back in 1992, we never would have dreamed that we would have this situation confronting us now with climate change. So there's that theme. And then there's the theme of him fulfilling his ambitions to be a father and a grandfather. And then there's the music, which is just poignant and heartwarming. So I'll put all together. It's just a brilliant plot. I love that. I love that show.
Well, one thing I really did like was the fact that even though he's been transplanted into this new life, he is still Jean-Luc Picard. He is still an explorer, a scientist. He's analyzing the soil samples. He's,
in the backyard with this Dobsonian telescope.
Yep.
notes about the star and probably looking at sunspots or luminosity or something, trying to figure out when it's going to go nova. Yeah.
Yeah, recommending the atmospheric condensers as a potential solution to the water problem. What else?
That brings up another point. The administrator, I forget his name, the Aresican administrator. He's plays a very conventional and yet alarming role where he knows what's going on, but he's not going to take any extreme measures to help the people save themselves, because then they get the clue that the end is coming. So it's better for them to be in ignorance. It's a story for our modern times as well, when administrators and leaders have to make a decision about whether to tell people that, the end is near and you must flee or take care of yourselves or take some action, or whether the best thing to do is to avoid the riot as precursor and say, well, we're just going to live in ignorance and bliss until the end arrives. So there's that thing that came into my mind when I was watching it.
And the idea that as he raised his daughter, he raised her she even says that he raised her as a scientist. So he's still being Jean-Luc Picard. He's raising her the way that I think he would have raised a son or daughter in the real world. If you know what I meant by that. He's passing down the knowledge. He's passing down the information, the way that he approaches things to her, and she's drawing the same conclusions he is. And it's because of the way he taught her that she's drawn those conclusions.
Yeah, what I thought was even more interesting was the interaction with his son. His son is really dedicated to music. And there's that scene in the backyard when his son tells Catan was the planet, Cayman was his name, tells Cayman that he's going to drop out of university. And Cayman says, "No, you aren't," with his command voice.
Yeah.
And where we all heard that before from parents. And then right away he realizes, wait a minute, his son wants to live his passion like I did. He wants to give up something to live his passion. And so there's that quick reversal, and you see that mental flexibility where the father realizes that for the son to do what he loves is more important than for the father to dictate that he stay in the university. That was a very strong statement about father-son relationship in just a few seconds.
Shift back for a second to the Enterprise and the efforts to take care of Picard. You have that conflict on the bridge when they were trying to interrupt the beam.
Mm-hmm.
Should we interrupt the beam? Should we not interrupt the beam? Worf points out that the captain's under attack. They have to act. Dr. Crushers, points out that, just because someone is stabbed, you don't always pull the knife out right away.
Right.
Very
That's
interesting
a great response.
Yeah. And so such a good interplay there. And of course, Riker now has to make the decision. Okay, what are we going to do? They decide to try to interrupt the beam. And this surprised me a little bit about the probe, because you had the distinct impression that if they severed the beam, it would have killed Picard.
Yeah.
And that seems like I know it's a TV show and I know it's written for dramatic effect, but that seemed to not be the way that the Catan race would want to be remembered, or would have fulfilled their objective. Wouldn't it have been better to at least, if the beam were interrupted for whatever reason, wouldn't it have been better to leave the individual with their memories?
Well, I can think of an analogy. In previous times, 100 years ago, some people had to undergo surgery, maybe in Civil War or other combat situations where their leg is gangrened or it's badly injured and they have to have the leg amputated. And the doctor says, calm down, bite on the stick. This is going to hurt like hell, but the outcome will be good, and this is good for you. So trust me. And that's how I kind of looked at that nucleonic beam as Data described it. The intention was to get the message through, and by creating these stresses in the part of Picard's body. It's the Catan civilization is basically saying, stand back, relax. We're in charge here. Let us take care of this. Let us play this thing out. When we're done, we'll let you know. I don't think that's that evil.
No, don't misunderstand. I did not think any of this was evil. It seemed like that if the technology existed to do this, it seemed like there should have been some kind of failsafe, because the beam could have been interrupted for reasons other than it being intentional. There could have been
a hardware failure.
Exactly. Yes, something.
Just crash on the Enterprise.
Yeah, or on the Catan probe, there could have been a problem. So that too surprised me a little bit. But again, I understand there's some dramatic license taken here. So
yeah, I think there's a lot of dramatic license there, because the first reaction is the captain's under attack. You remember Riker actually said, get the phasers ready. The captain's under attack. They would have destroyed the probe.
Yeah, well, of course, Worf wants to blow up everything. So, I don't think we'd be doing justice if we didn't mention the acting ability of Patrick Stewart. I mean, he obviously is Captain Picard as soon as he wakes up on Catan, but through his acting ability throughout the time as he ages is just really phenomenal. I mean, it makes you feel like he's really aging, not just the cosmetic part, but just the acting part. He's still Picard, and it's going to be interesting, I think, as you said, in the new Picard series, to see, how much of that of his acting ability reflects the way he aged on Catan.
Yeah, that was a pretty good makeup that they did, taking him through 40 years, from 50 to maybe 90. What I didn't understand, one thing I didn't understand about the show is why Picard came and didn't seem to know about the launch at the end of the show. He says, nobody ever told me about the launch. I have to drag him outside. He was on the console. He was up here in the science all along. He may have been even consulted on some of the building of the rocket. So how come he didn't know about the launch? What elements of storytelling were they trying to deliver when Kamen said he didn't know that there was a launch coming? I didn't understand that.
My guess would be that just unfortunately there was only so much time in the episode, and again it gets you to that point where maybe when they reveal that you've seen it before, and they're talking about the probe, that now you're approaching and you're starting to understand what's going on a little bit, and that it will be resolved. It's not going to be resolved with him remaining on Catan and dying. That there was a purpose behind this whole thing, which up to that point was not clear. This was happening, but why was it happening? And suddenly it became clear, because all the characters, Bataille and all the others, gathered around and were saying, we've been dead for 1,000 years, but now we will live on in your memory.
Maybe the fact that he didn't know that there was a launch coming was just a reflection of the fact that he was getting older and he was getting forgetful. Maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know.
But go back to the fact that this is a simulation he's experiencing. So the simulation can control what, the twists and turns and what would have been a surprise. And it's not like it was a real life. And at that point, there was no point in belaboring the fact that he kept saying, why didn't I know? Why didn't I know? Well, they explained why he didn't know, because guess what? You've already seen it before, and there was really no advancing of the plot for him in that simulation to know about it. They kind of ran up to the edge and at the end and say, okay, here we go. This is the end, and this is why you've been experiencing this. And then suddenly he's awake back on the Enterprise.
Yeah. And 25 minutes later, in real time.
And I loved Patrick Stewart's reaction to Dr. Crusher and to Rikers. He's looking at them like he's never seen them before, and even does a little stutter shake. It's like, oh, I think I know you, and it all starts to come rushing back after a lifetime of experiences somewhere else.
Interesting was after a 40-year gap, he remembered their names. Yeah.
Yeah, and and then he says, "I'm on the Enterprise," and then it all seems to start come rushing back. So
one of the things they never explored was that the aftermath of that. I mean, there was the reference to an exhibiting of the Rassican flute in later episodes, but I don't think there was ever any follow-up that suggested that Kirk was somehow affected by this experience. It's one thing for him to remember the life of these people and their culture, but as you mentioned, when he first woke up and he was struggling with Riker's and Crusher's names, how did this influence his ability to command the starship within hours or days after this episode? That was never explored.
Yeah, and some of that you have to just write off to the fact that it is a TV show, because we could have that same discussion about him being assimilated by the Borg. At some point, when are you sufficiently compromised not to command a starship? So.
Sometimes for the purpose of storytelling, it's better to hope for the best and just move on.
Exactly. But I love the fact it was a great way to wrap it up, that they brought the probe on board, they opened it up, and they found the flute inside, which of course was all part of the simulation he had just experienced for 40-something years. And so that had to sort of have that reverse effect of bringing all those memories rushing back.
Yeah, I don't know how to describe that in terms of storytelling. Closure, callback probably. Reference to something that happened before and then punctuating it at the end as a callback. I don't know why that music and that flute play such a powerful role. It's just sort of a gut feeling. It's hard to describe why the flute plays a pivotal role. But when you after, as a human being, when you watch it, there was something special there, and you feel a sense of admiration for the screenplay and the acting. But you have to ask, how would the show have been different without the flute? Why was the flute such a pivotal thing? Yeah, I don't know how to describe it, but it's obviously important and tugs at your heartstrings.
Well, it became kind of a touch point that he received it very, very shortly after the waking up on Catan, and they close out the show with him playing it after everything is over. And eventually they even make reference to the fact that he's gotten better. He's gotten better. He never did get as good as his son, apparently, but he got better time. So that was his proficiency with the flute almost, was part of the evolution of the whole experience.
Yeah, it sort of encapsulates or represents what he just went through in an emotional way. And as music touches people's hearts, so does the flute representation of what he went through emotionally during his 40-year journey. Yeah, it's all very subtle storytelling. Worked.
Yeah, and I remember the first time I watched it, I didn't appreciate a lot of these things. It seemed almost like an out of character kind of show for Star Trek, and sometimes those are the ones that take the longest, at least for me, to really learn to appreciate.
And the only one of the Next Generation that won a Hugo. I read that City on the Edge of Forever in the original series won a Hugo. So it's those kinds of episodes that sort of put a lot of things together into one show. The writing, the acting, the storytelling, the aching feeling for his what he went through, the humanity part of it, his ability to live out a life that he couldn't normally live. So many things come together in that episode that are more than just getting caught in a temporal loop and wiggling your way out of it.
Well, and to go back to something we talked about earlier, he's still Jean-Luc Picard, and so once as he accepts the life on Catan, he starts to speak up on issues of importance. He eventually becomes a member of, I guess, the ruling council, whatever it is. So exactly what you would expect from Jean-Luc Picard, should he be in that situation. He never changed his character. He just evolved along some different lines, but the core values were still there. The core drive seemed to still be there.
Yeah, when he first meets the administrator and he's standing next to Batai's introducing him, he comes out with this water condenser proposal in a very authoritative technical leadership role. God, I think it stuns the administrator a little bit that he's so forceful. He's still in his command authoritative mode to solve a scientific problem.
Well, but just what you said about his reaction to his son wanting to pursue music. I mean, that command voice, that command attitude is still there, and he sometimes has to temper it and pull it back a little bit as the circumstance dictates.
Yeah. I saw that on a TV show the other night. There was a fellow who was I forget which I was watching. It was a military-related show. And this fellow was using his command voice. He was an admiral or a general to dictate something. And then when the show was over and nobody was watching, he just kind of sat back and relaxed and laughed with his colleagues. Like, this is for the hat I put on in the air, or I present and project, but when I'm having a hamburger and playing with my kids, I'm just, an shucks, good old fellow.
Yeah. And I think we all do that to one degree or another. I mean, drill sergeants are notorious for being,
sure.
being pretty hard-nosed. Yeah.
The rest of us are trapped in a Dover cartoon.
Before we wrap it up, you kind of alluded to a couple things, but I wanted to ask you, you said Star Trek The Next Generation was your favorite of the Star Trek series. Was it because of Picard? Was it because of the strength of the characters or the strength of the storytelling, or just that particular time in your life when that particular Star Trek show was produced and aired?
That's a good question. I don't know that I can provide a fast answer to that. I think one way I can put it is in the engineering section, where you have that big table with the LCD display that's as big as the table. You got the work core in the background. You got the displays on the walls. I wanted that to be my office. I was ready to move in. There was something about the characters, Fiordi, Crusher, Data. I think I allude to Data, Lieutenant Commander Data, a lot in my writing, because I talk about robots a lot at the Mech Observer. And Data is the quintessential robot. It's the aspiration. It's the ultimate goal of all our robot technology, is to create Lieutenant Commander Data. So I think that just all the things came together. It was hugely better special effects, although for today, not so great. But for its time, the special effects were awesome compared to the original series, where you had a starship hanging from a string, and kind of dangling, and then you blot out the scene with some crude string with some crude video techniques, So not that Star Trek original series wasn't great, but I guess the atmosphere, the professionalism of Picard. Picard wasn't trying to get the entire galaxy population pregnant like Captain Kirk was. I think I got a lot more respect for the demeanor and the captain-like qualities of Captain Picard. So just all those things came together for me.
It's difficult, I think, to fairly compare any of the series, because you really do have to look at not only the times that they were produced in, and as you alluded to, the technology available, the culture, the messages that were trying to be conveyed at times by the writers and producers, because Star Trek is notorious for, holding up a mirror to our culture. Yeah, and so you look at all that, the quality of the actors, just there's so many things that I think that's one reason that I feel like every series has its own set of charms. There are places where you have to suspend disbelief, or suspend disbelief in different areas. Definitely you have to suspend a lot now. As we record this in 2019, when you're watching the original series, a little bit less maybe when you're watching Next Gen and so on. But at the end of the day, Star Trek remains such a cultural phenomenon and such a great launching pad for an amazing piece of Americana that has really transcended America and is now certainly a global thing.
Sure, I think the Star Trek, the original series, played a big role in it in its day, in encouraging and inciting young engineers, men and women, to work for NASA, to go into the space program, to aspire to be astronauts and to study science and engineering and travel to the moon and Mars and so on. So it came along at just the right time in the 60s, in concert with the Apollo program, to light our imagination up and talk about what we could possibly do.
Was that an inspiration to you, John, for your career?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I was an astrophysics major and watching Star Trek and adoring Mr. Spock. I read an article once that said that Mr. Spock helped a lot of young geeky teenagers get through life because he celebrated being the nerd. He was the first major television character where being a nerd was awesome, and you had respect for him. He could do mathematics. He could do warp calculations in his head, and the best the rest of us could do was memorize pi to 50 places. So
50 places, John?
Yeah, 3.1 for 159265358979323846264333832 79502884197169393751.
Okay. I'm going to have to look that up. I wasn't prepared for that. Okay. Is there any particular reason why you needed to memorize pi to 50 places?
Because I could, and because nobody else could.
That's a good enough reason.
And because Mr. Spock probably knew it to 200.
See, that's the John Martellaro I knew I was inviting to the program. Hey, John, thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun, and as I always do with these shows, I get some insights from a different angle, a different perspective. I feel like I need to go back and rewatch this show again based on some of what you said. So, thank you.
All right, you're very welcome, and you brought up some very good points too. So, thank you.
No, it's fun. I alluded to the fact that you do the Daily Observations podcast frequently for the Mac Observer, but you also do a couple other things that I want to make sure you highlight.
Oh, yeah, I am the host of a Mac Observer podcast called Background Mode, and I invite various developers, executives, scientists, researchers, authors to come on and tell their story about who they are and how they got where they are today. And we often talk about their current work and the excitement that comes from listening to somebody talk about their professional work, whether it's an astronomer or whether it's an archaeologist. I just had an archaeologist who was the first to look at satellite photos to identify archaeological sites, Dr. Sarah Parkak. So that was cool. So I've had 200 of these shows, and they're in the Apple Podcast system, and they're archived at the Mac Observer. So if you're interested in hearing stories from professionals in the field, inspiring stories about how they grew up and looked at the starlit sky and wanted to become an astronomer, and the challenges that they faced and the mentors they had and the things that they did, to become a professional today. That's what background mode is all about. So you can find that at the podcast tab at the top of Mac Observer.
And I would encourage everyone to do it because John has a really interesting mix of guests on there. As he said, scientists, people from the Apple community, from the tech community, but especially the science-oriented things are always they're. Every time I see a new episode come up, I feel like it's always interesting, and I feel like about 50% of the time it's unexpected. And yet I still absolutely enjoy every single one. So thank you for all that you do, John, for those 200 shows. Cool. Here's to 200. Here's to 200 more.
All right.
Thank you. We will do this again. I'll get you to pick another Trek favorite, and we'll have some fun with it.
All right. Cool. See you then.
All right. Folks, I'm Chuck Joyner. This is Trek Favorites. Let us know what you thought about this. Do you think John and I hit all the points? Did we miss anything? Do you agree, disagree? You can drop me an email, chuck@trekfavorites.com, or we are at Trek Favorites on Twitter, and there's a Facebook page as well where you can leave comments. Until the next time, thanks for joining us. Visit TrekFavorites.com to access all our shows, watch the video versions on our YouTube channel, and connect with us on Twitter and Facebook as @TrekFavorites.